Good evening. I am David Schneiderman, Associate Dean of the Faculty, Professor of English, and Director of the Center for Chicago Programs here at Lake Forest College. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the college and my great honor to welcome the Lake Forest Lake Bluff League of Women Voters. We are co-sponsoring the event with them tonight, but we haven't done any of the heavy lifting. This is a league event, and we're really happy that they've partnered with us to be here. Now to what we're here for tonight. If you find tonight's topic compelling, understanding the budget impasse, finding pathways to resolution, that says something about your interests. But it also says something about the current state of our state that is the topic for this moment. This event, curated by the League, will tell us about the prospects for our governor and legislature to work together toward tax reform and state budgeting. We're lucky to have a fantastic panel, and rather than my introducing them, I want to call up Wynn Kane, co-president of the League of Women Voters, who's going to give the official welcome for the event and lead us into tonight's program. So please join me in welcoming Wynn. Thank you for being here.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Wynn Kane, co-president with Liz Bradner of the League of Women Voters of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff. And we're happy to be co-sponsoring this evening with the Lake Forest College. Our program was arranged by our program chairman, Joy Guscott-Mueller and Carol Gale of the college. The League is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, national, state, and local political organization which encourages informed and active participation in government. It works to increase understanding of the major political policy issues and influences public policy through education and advocacy. I'd like to introduce Joy Guscott-Mueller, who will introduce our moderator for the evening. Joy?
Thank you, Wynn. I'm Joy Guscott-Mueller. I'm co-vice president of program with Carol Gale for the League of Women Voters for Lake Forest and Lake Bluff, and we're delighted that you've chosen to attend here this evening. This topic is always of great interest, not only to our members, but to the public at large, and these programs such as these are open to the public, but we encourage you to join the League and become a member. We accept both women and men as members, and we hope you'll consider doing so. I'd also like to thank our program committee and all the volunteers who have worked this evening to make this event a success. And I would also like to thank Melanie Rummel, our moderator. I would like to thank Julie Morrison, State Senator for the 29th District, State Representative Scott Drury for the 58th District, and Ralph Marteri, who's Executive Director for the Center of Tax and Budget Accountability. Throughout the evening, there will be folks in the aisles on the side and center who will be available to pass out indexed cards and pencils to you if you have a question that you would like to ask of any of our panelists. They will then be brought up to our moderator, Melanie Rummel, and she will present those questions herself to the moderators, and you can hear their answers at the end of the program. We're very happy to have Melanie serve as our moderator this evening. She's an experienced moderator and a former vice president for the League of Women Voters, and we're grateful that she came to share her talents with us this evening. Melanie Rummel practices with the law firm of Lesser, Luttree, Pasquesi, and Howe in Lake Forest. She is a member of the Lake County Bar Association, the Chicago Bar Association, and currently serves as president of the Lake County Bar Foundation. Ms. Rummel has served as an adjunct professor of law at Loyola University of Chicago and is also licensed to practice in the state of Wisconsin. No stranger to Lake Forest, Ms. Rummel is a lifelong resident and has contributed to the community, most recently as chairman of the Lake Forest Open Lands Association. She also served as president of the Lake Forest School District 67 School Board, president of the Women's Board of Catholic Charities, president of the Lake Forest Lake Bluff Volunteer Bureau, vice president of the Lake Forest League of Women Voters, and a member of the Community Center for Gorton Board of Directors. She is named as one of the North Shore Magazine's top 10 volunteers. Her husband, Mike Rummel, is a former mayor of Lake Forest and currently represents Lake Forest, Knollwood, and parts of Highland Park and Deerfield as the District 12 representative to the Lake County Board. Melanie Rummel graduated with a BA from Northwestern University and received her JD with distinction from Loyola University of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming our moderator for this evening's program, Melanie Rummel.
Thank you, Joy. I appreciate the introduction. It's my pleasure to introduce this very distinguished panel this evening, starting with Julie Morrison. After taking office, Julie Morrison committed her long history of advocating for children's welfare by pushing for the creation of a special subcommittee to find ways to improve Illinois' child welfare system. As chair of that committee, she has worked to help DCFS and other agencies charged with promoting the health and safety of the state's children find preschool procedural and legislative solutions to help increase efficiency and take down artificial barriers. Before joining the Senate, Morrison served as the governor's statewide advisory council to DCFS. Morrison has focused also on water safety. Her interest in this stems from a family tragedy when an intoxicated boater claimed the life of her young nephew. Championing this cause, Morrison passed laws requiring drivers who are involved in serious accidents to submit to drug and alcohol testing, allowing law enforcement officers to seize boats used in serious crimes and requiring boaters who are towing passengers on water skis or inner tubes to fly orange flags. Morrison also believes that improving the accountability and transparency of state government and promoting the environment are especially important for the communities in her 29th district. So far, she has passed laws making it easier for county boards to remove appointed officials who act unethically and requiring lobbyists to disclose their employers. She has also passed a law making it easier to recycle electronic equipment. Senator Morrison is the vice chair of the Human Services Committee and holds a seat on the Committee on Economic Development, Education, the Environment, and Conservation, and Transportation Committee. Morrison was born in the downstate community of Beardstown and graduated from Knox College. Senator Morrison served in Illinois as a legislative staff intern in their program in 1978 and 79. She also worked for Congressman John Porter as his field director in the 10th Congressional District, and was appointed by both Governors Thompson and Edgar to the Department of Children and Family Services Advisory Council. After serving on the DCFS Advisory Council, she took the position of supervisor of West Deerfield Township, which she held for 15 years. Senator Morrison lives with her husband, Joe, and the couple have 3 grown children. Senator Morrison, would you like to do your presentation, and then I will introduce the other speakers.
Well, thank you for the very nice introduction. Just a girl from Deerfield. Sorry that it was so long and wordy. I want to thank the League for having this. I think the timing could not be better, and thanks to all of you who came out this evening on sort of a misty 30-something cold evening. So I did go to Knox College, and we did come up to Lake Forest occasionally. They were in the Midwest Conference, and so there was a lot of good competitive football that was played between Lake Forest and Knox. So good thoughts about Lake Forest. I want to start doing a little bit of stepping back about a year, where we were a year ago, so that we can really talk about the impasse today. I think it's good to sort of review, and I'd like to give you a little bit of my personal story, what I was doing, what's been going on in the last year. And then I've got a slide presentation where we can actually look at the numbers and some of the funds in that. So about a year ago, the House and the Senate passed appropriation bills and sent them to the governor's desk. The governor signed one, which was the education funding for K through 12, and vetoed the others. And as a senator in my first term, I really expected, and a lot of my senior colleagues said, this won't last. We'll get together this summer, we'll figure this out. This, just be patient, this is gonna all happen. We're just getting our sea legs with this new governor. Well, summer came and went. And the more I would see people in Walgreens or Jewel or Sunset, the more people would say, why don't we have a budget? Julie, what is going on down there? I was frustrated as well, so I decided one of the things that I could do would be to go to talk to the governor. And in Springfield, you don't have an opportunity when you're a legislator just to sit down one-on-one with the governor. It just doesn't happen. He's incredibly busy, and our schedules never really mesh. So I found some time up in the district, and he allowed me to come down to his Chicago office, and we got to sit and talk for 45 minutes about the budget impasse. I was really honest with him. I said, I have 212,000 people, some of them are here tonight, that want a budget. And I need to be able to do everything that I can to bring that about. So what do you need me to do? And we sat and talked for probably 35, 45 minutes about the very specific things in his turnaround agenda that at the time were some of his key issues. I agreed with him on several of those. I was really honest in what I could and could not support. He asked about a property tax freeze. We talked about a fair map. And that whole, the fair map, that is something I talked to Peter Benzinger about, maybe 3 or 4 months ago in great detail about what that really meant, what that movement was. And I was happy to add my name to that petition into that movement. I think that's important, and I think this district wants it. So my point is, a lot of the things that the governor was talking about, things that he wanted, I thought were reasonable requests, and I thought they deserved, if not our vote, at least a step in the right direction. So time passes again, and there's no movement in the General Assembly. So I introduced a bill, Senate Bill 2159, which said that when there is a year that the governor, we do not have a budget in the state of Illinois, the 4 leaders, 1 from each caucus, and the governor must sit down together, 1 hour, a week, face to face in the same room. And I had people laugh at me and say, this is so infantile, this is so elementary, you can't tell leaders to do this. But in the reality, I didn't see, they weren't meeting. Staffs weren't even meeting. The people who were going to make the decisions that we were all looking to weren't even sitting in the same room together. And I don't know if you guys knew that, but it was really frustrating. So I thought this was at least something to bring people's attention to the fact they're not meeting. Well, that bill didn't get anywhere, but not for lack of trying. So I have a PowerPoint I'd kind of like to go through to kind of show you where we've been in the last year, where we are now, and then we can kind of take it from there. So Joe, if you'd hit the first one for me. This is one of my favorite ones. This is basically tells you where we're spending our money, and it's based on the last fiscal year that we had a budget, 2015. As you can see, we spend about 55 cents of every dollar on 3 things: Medicaid, which is health care for lower-income families and adults with disabilities, preschool through high school education, and pension cost. Human services, we only spend 12 cents on. And revenue sharing with local governments, which you've heard about local government distributive fund, that's included in that. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is a 10-year look back, if you would, from 05 to 15, and shows the spending in 11 years. So as you can see, pension, for example, is a big, is the thing that has grown. And I don't know if you can really see can you read the wording up there? I know it's big, but pensions is the thing that has had the biggest growth by far. You can see that that really started in around 2012, and Medicaid also was something that was a significant fund that grew. Higher ed, it's really kind of stayed flat. Okay, do you want to go to the next one, please, Joe? General fund revenues. So now that we have a general idea about where our money was going, where was it coming from? And I think this graph shows pretty well where the revenue came from for the last 11 years. Most of our money comes through income tax. And in 2011, when it was raised up to 5% for personal income tax, you'll see that there was a growth. Now that the income tax is back down to 3.75, we're estimating that it will be approximately $2.5 billion less. And similarly, about the $300 million less in corporate tax income. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is probably the most interesting, though hardest to read. And I have this available if anybody would like to see it later. A lot of times we talk about Illinois compared to other states. We have the worst taxes. We pay the most taxes. I think when you look at property taxes, it's a little different than the actual taxes that we are paying into the state, and sometimes we confuse those and blend that all together. Indiana, if you look at the other states here, there are adjacent states. Indiana is the only other state that has a flat income tax. Our income tax rate of 3.75 is lower than Indiana's when you add Indiana's county income tax. Illinois doesn't have that. And most of these graduated income taxes peak at a very low salary. For example, in Missouri, it's $9,000. When you make over $9,000, you're now paying at the top rate. I know this is something that is near and dear to the league because we've had some good discussions about that. Next one, please. All funds budget. Just kind of an overview, again, of 2015, when we last had a budget, where the dollars were coming from. You can see the federal dollars there in green. You can see, excuse me, no, that's not right. Can't see. General revenues in green. I thought that was wrong. Other state funds, which is one of the more difficult things that I think to describe. A good example I like to give are fees and licensing. So when you go get a new sticker or a new plate at the DMV, those dollars, that's part of the other state funds. Okay, let's look at revenue estimate. This is what we were presuming that we would have in 2016. $32 billion. And I think COGFA is showing us, and I'm sure Ralph will go into great detail. I don't think it's too far off. We may be a little better than that, but I think that's fairly accurate. So when we are putting our budget together a year ago, those were the dollars we were looking at, $32 billion. And as you can see, personal income is still the biggest part of it. And the federal funds a lot of times are pass-throughs. That's going to be like Medicaid funding, child care funding for people in need, things like that. And lastly, this slide that I think brings us to where we are tonight is the F-16 outlook. This is the reality pie chart. This is what we're spending now. The only appropriation that has been signed by the governor, as I said, is K through 12. Until, and this pie chart doesn't reflect it, Friday we passed legislation to do a Band-Aid or a bridge funding to higher education. That came about because our universities were in terrible shape. There were a couple, and I know you've read about it, I know this is an informed group, there were a couple universities that were literally talking about closing their doors in May. So in addition to that, MAP grant funds are included. About 40% is the MAP grant amount that we decided to fund. What does that get you? Right now, that's going to pay for fall tuition. So the classes that were taken from the fall up until December, most of those are going to be covered. The classes that kids are in now and hope to take next year, we haven't even begun to deal with. I had two very nice young men come see me last week, ironically, from Lake Forest College, who came. They are in leadership positions in the student body. They were well-spoken, they were articulate, and they asked me, please make sure you can get us some MAP grant funding. It'll make the difference of us being able to come back to school. So Friday we were able to take that vote. It was one of the first times that I saw the House and Senate and the Republicans and the Democrats show any degree of trust for each other. It was a baby step. But we did both pass a bill, and the governor has signed that, and I believe the comptroller is actually executing some of those checks this week. So it was a baby step, it's in the right direction. But at the same time, Human Services, which, as you've heard in my introduction and some of my remarks already, is a critical thing to me, and I think it's incumbent on us not to forget that as there are state universities and community colleges laying off staff and struggling, we have staffs being laid off, programs being dismantled, and it's not all superfluous things either. This is assistance for families with children who need daycare. This is CCP money. This is money that helps seniors stay in their homes. This is assistance to people who have grave disabilities and need personal care assistance. It's a whole wide range of things. It's people with autism. It's people with epilepsy. It's people with profound mental illness who just aren't going to get the help they need and instead are ending up in our emergency rooms or in jail, which costs a lot more money than having somebody get the intervention that they need. So the Senate, before we adjourned Friday afternoon, passed a bill for $441 million to, again, do a bridge to help some of those agencies stay afloat till we can come back together and do a permanent, more full budget. Again, I think it's a step in the right direction. The House will be taking that up next week when we all come back. So with that, I want to give my colleagues a chance to bring some of their points forward, and then I know there will be a lot of time for questions. So thank you very much for your attention.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Scott Drury, who is our state representative from District 58. Scott was elected to the Illinois House of Representatives in 2012 and currently serves as the vice chairman of the House Criminal Judiciary Committee. In his short time in the House, Scott has become widely known as one of the most independent legislators in the Illinois General Assembly, and he is frequently asked to comment on the state's most pressing issues. Scott's efforts as a legislator have received nationwide recognition, most notably for implementing assault weapons bans throughout the North Shore and protecting women from life-changing online harassment. As a legislator, Scott is passionate about protecting a woman's right to access health care, fixing Illinois' broken criminal justice system, implementing responsible gun laws, and restoring Illinois to fiscal strength. Before joining the House, Scott served as an assistant U.S. attorney in Chicago. In addition to his legislative duties, Scott is an adjunct professor of law at Northwestern University Law School and practices law in the private sector. Please join me in welcoming State Representative Scott Drury.
Hi, good evening. I'm Scott Drury. I'm the state representative for this area and the surrounding area. I want to thank the League of Women Voters and Lake Forest College for having me here to talk about what I think is the most pressing issue confronting our state right now, which is this budget impasse, budget standoff, budget stalemate, budget nonsense. Whatever we want to call it, it is the most pressing issue because it affects all of us one way or another. If we were to go around the room, every single person here can talk about something that they may not even know is intertwined with the budget, with Illinois' budget, but it is. So my goal here today, one is to be brief, and two is to give you my perspective on how we got here, why there is an impasse, and possibly what can be done. So I'm just going to start off with some basic facts. Because I think sometimes we don't all start with the same foundation. We all have our own understanding of what we think is really going on. So I'm going to give you what I believe are facts that we can all build upon. So first, it's really important for everybody in the room to understand that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans in Springfield in fiscal year 2016 presented a balanced budget. Neither the Republicans nor the Democrats proposed a balanced budget. Governor Rauner's budget was short by about $2.5 to $3 billion. The Democratic budget was short by about $4 billion. I'm not making light of the extra billion, but my point is that neither side was able to meet our expenditures with our revenue. And that's critical because it tells us something. It tells us that the budget, from the get-go, doesn't matter what party you're in, from the get-go, we're short. And whether it's someone who wants to cut his or her way to fiscal stability or wants to raise revenue, neither side was able to do it. Both parties, Republicans and Democrats, have both said that some form of new revenue is needed. Okay, because a lot of times people say this is a Democratic issue and we just want to raise taxes. The fact is that Governor Rauner has repeatedly stated that he believes that there needs to be a new source of revenue. He hasn't talked about what it would be. He's mentioned sales taxes, he's mentioned some other taxes, but he has said that he believes there needs to be new revenue, possibly even increasing the income tax, but it has to come with some strings attached, which is what's become the turnaround agenda. But it's important to know that neither side can balance the budget, and both sides have publicly stated that additional revenue is needed. But here's the problem. Both parties want to avoid any blame for the second bullet point. Okay? So both parties say we need revenue, but who is going to be holding the hot potato at the end of the battle? And that is why we don't have a budget. Okay? It's that simple. Governor Rauner campaigned on a theme of roll back the income tax. If I'm the governor, we will roll it back to 3.75%. I'm a Democrat. I actually supported that because I said I think we need to do a reboot. We need to see, let's bring it back to 3.75 and see how we do. If people don't like 3.75, then we'll have to increase it. But what happened for too long was that we were living on fumes, and both Republicans and Democrats got used to free government. And no one really knew what percentage we were bringing in. And it was important to me, for the public, for all of you, for me, for my family, for your families, to see what does 3.75% buy. And if you like it, then we can keep it. If you don't like it, then what's going to be the number we need to get to? Governor Rauner is showing everybody what 3.75% looks like. Senator Morrison just showed you what 3.75% looks like. It's funding our colleges this year at 30% of the funding they need. It's going to fund our human services maybe at 60%, maybe at 50%. And if that's what the public wants, we're public servants. We serve you. And if that's what the public wants, then that's what the public wants. If it's not what we want, then we need to have the discussion about where we need to get to. The General Assembly, which is controlled by Democrats, allowed it to roll back to 3.75%. Just as the governor asked. But we also believe that because he asked for it to roll back to 3.75%, it shouldn't require 71 Democrats in the House and 36 Democrats in the Senate to increase the tax. There should be some Republican support for this. We gave the governor what he wanted, and I'm saying this is the general impression. These aren't my views. This is the general impression in Springfield. We gave him what he wanted. If he doesn't like it, then he needs to help increase the tax back up to some number that he liked. It should be bipartisan. For his part, the governor has stated, I agree. I think that we do need to raise it. He's thrown out the number 4%, 4.25%, maybe even a little higher, but he doesn't want to just increase taxes because that would just look like he's raising taxes. So he's put some strings on it. We need to get rid of plaintiffs' lawyers in Illinois. We need to take some harsh measures against labor. We need to have independent maps, which I support. I actually, before he drew up the amendment, I proposed it back in February. But that is what the governor wants, and he's attached that to that so that he can go back and say, yes, we've raised taxes, but look what we got in return. So that's the baseline. That's where we're starting the conversation. These three basic facts are key to understanding everything else that goes on. And if you only knew those three facts, you could really explain the rest of the last 11 months of why we don't have a budget, is that we can't come to an agreement on how to resolve them. So let's look at some federal facts, because there's another government that doesn't always get along either, right? And as dysfunctional as Illinois is, the fact is that in the last 40 years, there have been 18 times on the federal side where they have been unable to reach a budget in a timely manner. 18 times in the last 40 years. When I was in the federal government, I was one day away from being the 19th time, but it was avoided on a Sunday night, and we were allowed to go back to work on Monday. The longest impasse they have had in those 40 years, those 18 times, was 21 days. We're going into our 11th month here in Illinois. The federal side, 21 days. So what's the difference? Why could they get their act together on the federal side in 3 weeks, and we're going on 11 months, and if you ask a lot of people, when is it going to end? Most of them can say, we're not sure. What is the difference? Well, on the federal side, when government shuts down, government shuts down. You call up the Social Security office to get your benefits, you know what? No one's picking up the phone. You need any services from the government, EPA, no one's there to help you. Government shuts down except for law enforcement. And guess what happens when government shuts down and people can't get their services? People get really angry. Everyone in this room gets really angry because there's something that you need from the federal government. It could be the IRS. You have to call for something, and they're not there. And so politicians, by nature, are not very strong-willed people. And if enough people get angry fast enough, then action is taken. And on the federal side, action is taken in 21 days to get it resolved, because they don't want to deal with the situation of the electorate being that angry for too long, because it may mean that you're not going to be elected next time. So how does that compare to Illinois? Well, in Illinois, we've been in an impasse since June of 2015. It's almost June of 2016 now. We all know that someday the weather will understand that as well. It is my view that it actually has been a bipartisan effort to prolong this impasse. Let me say that again. There's been a bipartisan effort to prolong this impasse. Because what has happened in the last 11 months? Well, the Republican base in Illinois is as strong as it has ever been, rallying behind the governor's call. And the Democratic base is as strong as it has ever been, rallying behind the Democrats' call. Let's not forget, it was just a couple of years ago that it was the Democrats that passed major pension reform. And a lot of the Democratic base was frayed, because Democrats were seen as going against labor. Well, now, if you were to ask anyone in labor who they're behind, it's the Democrats, because we are fighting Governor Rauner. There is a villain that we can all get behind and fight. And so from an election standpoint, forget the public. From an election standpoint, this impasse isn't so bad. Again, not my views, but I mean, this is just the reality as I see it. And so what has happened? Well, instead of government shutting down in Illinois, as Senator Morrison said, 90% of government kept running. And, you know, I wish I could quote John F. Kennedy and say it's been a profile in courage, but it's been a profile in cowardice. It's been exactly the opposite, because there was this race to keep government open. Exactly the opposite of what keeps the government shutdowns so short, so brief on the federal side. In Illinois, we did the exact opposite. We did everything possible to keep it going. The first thing that happened was there was about 2 days where we thought Illinois employees, our employees, one of them's here, Senator Morrison's district director, legislative director, he's in the back there. I'm going to assume they had the same conversation I had with my staff of, am I going to get paid, Senator Morrison? Scott, am I going to get paid? You know, my district director, she is the sole breadwinner for her family. She's got one child. Her husband is in grad school. And there was a period where it looked like she wasn't going to get paid for however long this impasse was going to go on. Well, that was resolved in about 2 days because the governor and I think the attorney general ran to court to find out if they can get paid and made sure that they got paid. Well, okay, so now they're paid. So if this was a pressure tank that was about to boil over, we lifted up the lid and we let the pressure out. So now there wasn't this immediate rush to have a budget, because we didn't have to walk into work every day and either have no employees or have them complain that they weren't getting paid. At the same time, there were a lot of court cases going on to get services paid. And this resulted pretty quickly in 90% of Illinois' budget being spent. So we didn't see this dramatic shutdown, and we didn't see this huge problem. We didn't feel the pressure as legislators to get stuff done. There came a moment in November of 2015 where I thought, this is it. We're going to have a budget. And that came with this issue. It's called the motor fuel tax. When you buy gas, there's a tax on it, and it's a pass-through. It all gets collected in Springfield and then gets redistributed back to the municipalities. We hadn't released that money. Winter was coming, and the motor fuel tax pays for road salt. So in November, all of the mayors across the state got really angry. Winter is coming. We don't have our road salt. I guess this winter they probably didn't need it. But they started calling all of us. You know, we're going to shut down. Everyone's going to be angry. We're going to tell our constituents who are your constituents, and everyone's going to be really mad. So two things could have happened there, right? We could have said, there's a budget standoff. There's no road salt for you. But instead, legislation was introduced to allow the motor fuel tax money to be distributed. And whether I'm somewhat proud of this fact, and some people criticize me for it, there was a unanimous vote in the House and the Senate, but for one person, to allow the road salt and all this money to be distributed. I dissented. And I didn't dissent because I don't think Highland Park and Lake Forest and Lake Bluff and Deerfield and all the other towns I represent, or town anyone represents, didn't need road salt. I saw this as a blown opportunity to get a budget. Because instead of allowing that pressure to build up and force us to do our job, instead, we just lift the lid up. We lifted the lid up again, and we let the pressure out, and we all went home for Thanksgiving, and we all went home for Christmas, and we all felt good about ourselves. And again, I've been criticized for this, but I call it the legislative heroin syndrome. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that we have continuously since June done things in the General Assembly that makes us as legislators feel good. It doesn't necessarily help you as the public, but that's not really what seems to be the issue. So the pressure builds, and it doesn't feel good, so we get some legislation, and if it was a drug, we shoot ourselves up with it. It makes us feel good, even if it's hurting everybody around us. And we feel good until we don't. And when we don't, guess what happens? We have some more legislation. And so the latest thing, because pressure was starting to build again, Senator Morrison talked about this. Higher ed funding. It's a real problem. and hopefully you can see some of the numbers, but there were talks of some of our universities in the state actually shutting down, not just firing somebody, but closing their doors, and it was going to happen this week that we're in now. Now, the governor has on his desk a bill that would have funded higher ed at 100%. It would have funded social services at 100%. The governor said he's going to veto that legislation, but he hasn't. It's been sitting there. And we get to Springfield last week, and people started saying we have to fund higher ed. Well, there's this bill sitting there. The governor has complete control over what he wants to do with it. But some people got scared, said, well, what if he doesn't sign it? What's going to happen? So a bipartisan bill was introduced. These are the numbers. And what I want you to look at, and I apologize if it's too small, but the last line where it says total, what we funded was $600 million. 32% of what is universally believed what was needed to actually fund higher education. So we passed a 70% cut to higher education, and we went home for a week. And in the papers, it's been touted as this bipartisan effort, and isn't it great that everybody's working together and we got something done? Well, the vote in the House on that bill was 106-2. So I at least doubled what I had for the motor fuel tax. Right? If we're going to talk about numbers, I had a 100% increase. But I voted against it. And again, not because I'm against higher ed funding. I mean, this could be sold two ways. We funded higher ed, or we cut higher ed by 70%. Now, there's people who say, well, this is just a stopgap measure. It's going to get us through to something. Well, where is the other money coming from? The fiscal year 16 ends June 30th. It's April 26th. Where is the other $1.2 million coming from? We haven't found it in the last 11 months. And so I have real concerns about doing this. Yes, it allows for press releases. And yes, it takes the pressure off us. And yes, it could be part of the legislative heroin syndrome. But the problem is this now probably becomes the baseline to start fiscal year 17. Because if universities get through 16 and they're not shut down, and they only got 30% of their funding, well, someone out there is going to say, that's all they need. And maybe that's right. I mean, maybe that's right. But that is what we did. And I think it's important that everybody see it for what it is. If you agree that that's what the cut should be, then this was a wonderful day. If you think that that was a horrible cut, then it was a horrible day. But I don't think it was some grand bipartisan kumbaya moment, because the governor had a budget there that he could have signed, he could have vetoed, he could have done whatever he wanted to. But if it was a game of chicken, the General Assembly blinked. And we vetoed our own bill. He didn't even have to. And so what does that tell us going forward? Well, social services is up. Maybe we run that bill next week that the senator talked about. Maybe we don't. Like I said, that's going to be at about 60% funding, maybe a little bit less. But does that become the baseline for next year? Because social services over the last 10 years has been decimated in Illinois, decimated. Yet we're about to vote on something that cuts it another 40%. And so that is what is going on in Illinois. And so what's the solution? I think it takes a profile in courage. It takes a profile in courage from everybody in the General Assembly. And that profile in courage, and this is just my opinion, means that we stop voting on these piecemeal efforts. We need a budget in Illinois. And we don't need people to vote on a piecemeal budget and then tweet, we need a full budget. We don't need people to say, boy, I voted for this piecemeal budget, I feel really bad, I really wish we had a full budget. We need people to stand up and say we need a full budget, and the only way we're going to get a full budget is to look at the only other example we have, which is the federal government. And the federal government, going back to that slide, they have been able to do it in the last 40 years, 18 separate times in 21 days or less. And they do that because they shut things down for a very brief period of time. Nobody wants to do that. I don't want to do it, but we're here. It's already been done. And I don't see how prolonging it and then cutting things by 40%, 70%, 60%, how that is the solution. The solution is to come together and say, what do we need as a whole Does it take revenue? Does it take cuts? Does it take both? Is it a sales tax? Is it an income tax? Is it a tax on sugar? Whatever it is, we need to have those conversations. I've proposed both sides proposing their own budget under seal at the same exact time, and then let's debate those. The public likes the idea. They don't like it in Springfield because I think it might get us a budget. So it's that simple. If you take the basic facts I started with, you take the basic solution here, we could have ourselves a budget in, I think, 21 days or less. But it requires all the members of the House and all the members of the Senate to buy into this theory. Right now I have 2, and hopefully we'll make that 3 and then 4 and then 5, and then we will get a budget. Otherwise, I think fiscal year 17 starts looking eerily like fiscal year 16. Thanks so much for your time.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Ralph Martiri. He's Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. In February of 2011, he was appointed to serve on the U.S. Department of Education Equity and Excellence Commission. Mr. Martiri teaches a master's class on education, finance, and fiscal policy for the University of Illinois and Roosevelt University, where he is also a distinguished lecturer on public policy. Additionally, he has taught fiscal policy seminars for various universities and the International Fulbright Scholar Program. Mr. Martiri has received numerous awards for his work on education policy reform, including the 2007 Champion of Freedom Award presented by the Rainbow Push Coalition to individuals whose professional work embodies Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s commitment to equal educational opportunities, and the Ben C. Hubbard Leadership Award given by Illinois State University to individuals who have greatly benefited education in Illinois. He was elected to serve on the school board of River Forest District 90, where he still serves. Ralph is also a regular columnist on education, fiscal, and economic policy for the State Journal Register and the Daily Herald. Mr. Martiri graduated from Indiana University Phi Beta Kappa with a BA in history, and he received his JD from the University of Michigan. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Martiri.
Good evening. So I am Ralph Martiri. I'm Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. We are an odd duck. We are not technically nonpartisan. We are the dreaded bipartisan. That means my board of directors has Democrats and Republicans on it who neither like or trust each other very much. And that's fantastic for us at staff because it allows us to focus on best practices and data. And frankly, I don't care if a particular initiative is liberal or conservative or somewhere in the middle. If it meets demographically driven needs, if it's predicated on best practices, the kind of thing we're going to support. If it's not, we won't. It's that simple. So what I'm going to do is try to talk about a little bit of context for the state's fiscal problems, starting very much where Senator Morrison started, looking at the 2015 budget, the good old days when we had a state budget. So this is the general fund budget, and you can see I broke it down into 2 parts. The top part is something we call hard costs, things over which there's absolutely no discretion. They have to pay by law. And that's $11 billion of the $35 billion general fund as it existed in 2015. And you can see the 3 hard costs are very simple: debt service to third-party banks and bondholders, the pension payment, which is the subject of a continuing appropriation, and then something called other statutory transfers out. Now, these are primarily 2 things. They are the local government distributive fund, where the state shares its income tax revenue with local governments, and Medicaid transfers required under the joint federal state funding program for Medicaid. That's $11 billion right off the top. Nobody votes. Nobody ever votes. It's by law. Then you see the $24 billion in somewhat discretionary spending. I say somewhat because there's not as much discretion as you would think. And there, 9 out of $10 goes to 4 things: education, health, social services, and public safety. That is historically where the state has spent its somewhat discretionary money on those 4 things. A number of folks say that, Springfield can get its act in order if they just rearrange their priorities and straighten those things out. which of education, health, social services, and public safety doesn't constitute a legitimate priority for state government to be investing in? You know, a lot of times I feel that the rhetoric involved in these tax policy and budget discussions is so divorced from the reality, primarily for, dare I say it, political reasons. So you'll hear elected officials talk about things like across-the-board cuts as a way to solve all problems, right? Doesn't that sound good? Across-the-board cuts? That allows people saying that to hide the board. So I'm telling you that the board is and always has been education, health, social services, and public safety. You see two other items there which I love to list. There's the group health insurance cost. That's the liability that the state incurs to pay the health costs for its workers. Never, and I mean never, in the state's history has it actually budgeted the full liability for group health. It always has put in a smaller number than what officials know the actual liability will be. That's important. Keep that in mind. It's going to come back again and again in my presentation. And then there's the 4% of discretionary money. That's everything else. Economic development, agribusiness, open spaces, the parks, environmental protection. And my favorite thing that state government spends our money on, waste, fraud, and abuse. Now, unfortunately, there's no line item for waste, fraud, and abuse. And really, if we could just get that in the budget, that'd be fantastic. We would agree to waste, fraud, and abuse this amount this year and be done with it. I point that out because every, and I mean every, peer-reviewed efficiency analysis of the public sector says if the public sector were magically to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse and be as efficient as possible, savings would be anywhere from 0.5 to 1.5, 1.8%. Bear in mind that at the end of this fiscal year, which doesn't have a budget, our accumulated deficit in this general fund, and just the bottom half, just the education health half, because the hard costs have to be paid by law, so they're not really subject to the deficit. They're going to be paid every year, is going to be over 40%. Our current funding on current services will be 40% deficit-based funding if we don't get a budget. So if we were magically going to save this 0.2 to 1.8% out of our budget, we've really not solved any problems. One more thing about waste, fraud, and abuse. It's the kind of thing that's used to shield a political system from dealing with very tough, contentious political issues like tax policy. I was, I don't think you indicated this in my introduction, a corporate attorney before I went into this practice. I was a partner in a law firm. I did mergers and acquisitions, structured finance, intellectual property. In fact, I represented pretty much Fortune 5 companies and banks. I was an evil corporate lawyer, and I was very, very good at it. So thank you very much. I don't know of one business that has zero waste, fraud, and abuse. If you have businesses or governments with lots of money, smart people are going to get in there and figure out ways to waste, fraud, and abuse it. We always have to be vigilant in ferreting it out, limiting it, and eliminating it whenever possible. But we can't let the fact that some minor amounts of money, and in context it is minor, gets misspent, stops us from politically dealing with what we have to deal with. And if you want the spoiler alert, we need a tax increase. And that's an opinion we have reached at the center based on the data. So I'm going to get into some of the data that drew us there. Here is our spending on those 4 core services since 2009. Has it been going up? Nope. Straight line down. By the way, this doesn't adjust for inflation. This is in nominal dollars. So in real terms, we're spending even less. I will point out that the temporary tax increase became law in 2011. After the temporary tax increase, we continued the trend of cutting spending on current services every single year, even though we had additional revenue, rhetoric aside. The rhetoric being, well, we got this temporary tax increase, we just spent it all. Not on services. We spent it on 2 things. Number one, paying past due bills. When that temporary tax increase revenue came in, our accumulated deficit was close to $14.5 billion. And we got it down to 5.94. So we paid back some past due bills. And the other thing we did was pay the growth in the pension debt. And I'm going to get into that in a second. You'll see one minor uptick here. See from 2013 to 2014, that little blip up? Two things. Most of it, about 70% of that blip up, was when we had to add some Medicaid spending back into the budget we'd cut under the SMART Act years before. But because the Medicaid program is a joint federal-state program, many of those cuts had to be approved by the feds. The feds said, no, can't do those things. So we added them back. The rest of that little blip up, and it's a small part of the blip up, Senate President John Gorton decided that always drastically under budgeting the actual liability for group health is not maybe the most transparent way to approach public sector budgeting. And so he began an initiative where every year he started ticking up the amount in the budget for the liability. It didn't impact the liability at all. It just impacted how much of it we all knew existed. That's it. There has been no increase in spending since the temporary tax increase took place. But what has gone up, and I think Senator Morrison made this point, is our pension payment. I want to show you how dramatically. So these are those hard costs, that top part of the budget they have to pay by law, broken out by type. The bottom bar there in the blue, that's our debt service to third parties. Note that there wasn't any towards the beginning of this decade. Then by 2010, we suddenly had some. You know what it was? Pension debt. That's all pension obligation bonds. The state didn't have enough money to actually make the payment into its pension systems required by law, so they borrowed it from third parties and then had to pay it back. And for those of you who are a little fiscally challenged and don't do this every day, that's not a sustainable way to operate government. I'm just telling you. All right, that middle bar, the kind of orangey color, that's those statutory transfers out. Again, primarily Medicaid and local government distributed fund. If you look at that over the last 12, 14 years, not much of an increase. It barely kept up with inflation in real terms. Then there's that gray bar. That's the change in the pension payment. Note that it grew from $1.4 billion to north of $6.8 billion in 2016. Why? I'll tell you. It's pretty much all debt service. It's not pension payment, not in the true sense of the word. During this entire sequence, the normal cost of funding benefits for that pension system, the employer normal cost, ranged from $1.2 billion to $1.6 billion a year, depending on actuarial assumptions, et cetera. All the rest is the repayment plan for the pension debt, what the state borrowed against its pension systems, that was passed in 1995 called the pension ramp. Have you all heard the pension ramp? It was a brilliant piece of legislation passed in 1995 when the state was facing a then $17 billion deficit of unfunded liability in its pension fund. $17 billion. Today it's north of 111, so the good old days. But they might have been good old days from a dollar amount. They weren't from a funded ratio standpoint. We were only 54% funded in our 5 state pension systems. You're healthy at 80%, according to the Congressional Budget Office, so we were a tick away from healthy. So what the governor at the time and the General Assembly at the time decided to do is say, we're going to put in a payment plan so that we will get our pension systems healthy, 90% funded by the year 2045, if we make every one of these payments to the system over time. The reason we had this pension debt, we were underfunding our systems, was the political decision was being made through 1995 to not make the contribution to the pension system they should have made, and instead divert that revenue to cover the cost of providing what? Education, health, social services, and public safety. They used revenue that should have funded the pensions to subsidize the cost of delivering current services to taxpayers. So for generations, the taxpayers in Illinois have not actually paid the full cost of the services they've consumed in taxes. The pensions have subsidized it. Now, they were doing that because, and I have a picture of this in a graphic or two, the state has a structural imbalance. Its revenue growth doesn't keep up with service cost growth, even if no programs are added, if you just adjust for inflation, et cetera. So a political system that hates dealing with tax policy, in fact, Illinois has been artificially low tax for generations at the state level. To maintain that status as low tax, the political system jumped through hoops to fund current services. The greatest hoop they found was underfunding pensions and diverting what should have gone to the pensions to fund services, and then simply write an IOU to the systems. Now back to that 1995 law. It's a funding law, right? You're going to be repaying the debt. They passed it. They had the same structural deficit, mismatch between revenue growth and service cost growth that they had before they passed the law, and they didn't pass a nickel of revenue to fund it. Now, who thought that might work? And the answer is no one in office at the time, because by law, what they did under the pension ramp was grow the unfunded liability by over $43 billion for the next 15 years. Not only wasn't a repayment plan for those first 15 years, it was statutorily authorized borrowing and aggressive borrowing. And then all the repayments were thrown into the far distant future. Welcome to the far distant future. That is us, that is now, and that's what they're facing. That is a debt payment. We shouldn't even call it a pension contribution. And I'm saying that because this pension reform bill, I think it was referenced, Scott, did you reference the pension reform bill? Focused on benefits, and benefits didn't drive this problem. In fact, the normal cost of our benefits are average and certainly sustainable. They'd be about $1.5 billion right now. If that was our cost of our pension system, no one would be talking about a pension crisis. It's almost $7 billion because of all the debt layered on top. Here's a graphic, and this is from the state's own numbers, of the items that have contributed to the growth in the unfunded pension liability since the passage of that pension ramp bill in 1995. The blue bars are items inherent to the pension systems themselves. So you see salary increases are actually negative. Pension benefit increases, actuarial assumption changes, other factors, basically public sector workers really keep living a lot longer than we actually want them to. It's problematic. If they really wanted to save money, they could pass legislation encouraging retired former public sector workers to drink a lot, then drive without seatbelts, and much money would be saved. Then you see other factors, investment losses. That's the Great Recession, $17 billion. Let me give you some context. Our state systems today are 39% funded, a far cry from healthy. If our only problems over this sequence were the blue bars, those items actually inherent to the design of the pension system itself, we'd be about 72% funded today. In 30 years, you could get 80% funded pretty easily. You throw in the Great Recession, it drops us down to about 62% funded, 60. Still a very rational, approachable path to solvency for the pension systems in 30 years. The red bar is the principal amount borrowed from the pensions over this sequence that bears interest that compounds annually. That's what's killing us. And we're borrowing the money because we don't have adequate tax revenue to fund education, health, social services, and public safety. Now, I run a bipartisan fiscal policy group. We'd be all for the state living within its means if, in fact, its means supported life. But the bottom line is our revenues are inadequate to fund services to the level demanded by our population's simple demography. If you can't meet your population's needs and you happen to have the capacity, Illinois' annual economy is $775 billion. The tax increases we need to solve all our problems, they're big. We peg it at somewhere between 7 and 8 billion in new revenue over and above what they have today. 1%. That's 1% of our state's economy. In context of the state's economy, that's a tax increase which is so small, it cannot be measured by any peer-reviewed econometric model that academics have developed to look at whether your tax increase is going to hurt your economy. It is too small. That, and being artificially so low tax, and the lack of political will to deal with tax policy is what put us in this horrible fiscal condition we have today. The pension crisis is a symptom that is now contributing to the cause. We need to focus on tax policy. So here's our revenues under current law. We did have the phase down of the temporary tax increase that passed in 2011. So 2014, you see at the far left there, that was the last year in which the state's temporary tax increase was fully in place. And you can see we had about $36 billion in revenue. The phase down began halfway through fiscal year 15. So fiscal year 16 is the first year that the total impact for a whole year, the phase down in that rate from 5 to 3.75% is going to be felt. It's a loss of $4 billion in revenue. Now, Scott, I think, very clearly said that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans put a balanced budget proposal on the table for 2016. If you read our analysis of the 2016 budget proposals, you will see that is in fact true. And in fact, our accumulated deficit at the end of 2015 was $5.94 billion. And under either the governor's proposal or the Democrats' proposal, that deficit, if their proposal became law for 2016, that deficit would jump to north of $9 billion. 5 and 4 is what? 9! We lost $4 billion in revenue. We had a $5 billion and change deficit. Now it's going north of 9. Because we lost revenue. It's not a spending problem. The state has been cutting spending on current services every single year. We underfund them. Compare Illinois, the 5th largest state with the 5th largest economy of any state in America, to every other state. We are in the bottom half to bottom third in spending per capita or as a percentage of GDP, despite having the 5th largest population and economy. If you isolate us out by service area, we drop to the bottom 10 in every single service category. We're not a high-spending state, folks. We ranked 49th out of the 50 states in number of state workers per capita. 5th largest population. All the arguments that focus on the spending side of the ledger pander to people's beliefs and preconceived notions, but do not reflect what the evidence indicates is actually happening. So this is a breakdown of who benefited from the phase down of the temporary tax increase. And the Democrats passed it on a purely partisan vote, and the governor did request that the Democrats let it phase out, and so the Democrats let it phase out. There was a little bit of conversation when it was being phased out by, frankly, people in both parties. So this is another bipartisan thing. See, that's the great thing about having a bipartisan organization. You can tweak either party, and they can both get mad at me, and that's sort of what I drink a lot, so it's okay. But one of the rationales given was, gee, at least if we allow the temporary tax increase to phase down, it'll help low and middle income families by cutting their taxes, help them get along a little better, and stimulate the Illinois economy. So a good and a good at least will come out of it, and then we'll figure out what we need to do with revenue. This has been peer reviewed by the Illinois Department of Revenue, and it is Illinois Department of Revenue data sets. If you go to the far left, that's your net Illinois income group by taxpayer. So that's your net taxable income in Illinois. Why did we do it that way? That's the way the Illinois Department of Revenue could sort their data. You see that 13% figure? That's the dollar value of the tax relief, 13%, went to those taxpayers that had $35,000 a year or less in taxable income. Now go over here to the far right. They happen to represent the bottom 60% of all taxpayers. To repeat, only 13% of the dollar value of the tax relief went to the bottom 60% of taxpayers. This is not a tax break that helps low and middle income families. It just isn't. Then go to the bottom category there, where 54% of the tax relief went, it went to the top 11% in taxpayers and income. Now, I wanted to do top 10% because that's what everybody does. But the Illinois Department of Revenue couldn't sort their data that way. We wanted the Illinois Department of Revenue to peer review our work, so there you go, you got top 11%. That's the closest we could get. Over half. Millionaires, so to be very clear, people with $1 million a year in taxable income or more. These would frankly be my constituents in Tawny Little River Forest where I live, okay? I live in one of the communities that's up there at the top of the ladder. Millionaires under this tax relief got average annual tax cut of $36,700, which is more than everyone in the bottom 60% has in annual taxable income. So, conclusions to draw from that. Number one, it's not going to help low and middle income families. They don't get the benefit. Number two, it's not going to stimulate the economy. Why? Our economy is predicated on consumer spending, people buying junk and such. 68 to 70% of all economic activity is consumer spending. Good consumers are people down there at the bottom and middle. You know why? They don't save. When you give them a little bit of extra money, they have what economists call a high marginal propensity to consume. They take that money and they spend it in their local economy. And they do that because their incomes have been declining after inflation since 1980. Now you flip to the top 10%, so sadly this is 11%, it's a little off. They don't spend when they get additional money because their incomes, according to federal data, have been growing significantly after inflation since 1980. They have what economists call a low marginal propensity to consume. They don't tend to spend if they get tax relief or any additional income. They tend to save or create a trust fund for junior, or if they do decide to spend, take that trip to Paris for a weekend. So, number one, we're taking money out of the state coffers that we need to fund core services. We're giving it to people that aren't going to spend it in the economy, and we're missing the people that would. But to pay for it, we're cutting spending on current services. Current services are education, health, social services, and public safety. What is that spending really? It's the wages of the teachers and the social workers and the healthcare providers and the correctional officers online providing the service. In fact, that's around 68 to 78% of the spending every single year, depending on the year, is just the wages of the people providing the services. So when you cut spending on those wages, those are middle income families that tend to spend their income, and you use that cut to pay for tax relief that goes to people who don't spend, what you get is net economic harm. You will actually lose private sector jobs from tax policy like this. That's not my conclusion alone. Every peer-reviewed analysis of this done at the academic level comes up with the same conclusion, as does the Congressional Budget Office, as does the Small Business Administration, as does a guy named Mark Zandi. Do you know who Zandi is? He's the principal economist at Moody's, the bond rating agency. In case you're worried, he's one of those liberal economists. When Republican Senator ran against Barack Obama, Republican Senator John McCain ran against Barack Obama for the presidency the first time around, Zandi was McCain's economic advisor. He's a Republican economist who works at a bond rating agency, not the profile of a liberal. And then on overall tax burden. I think here, when you're comparing state to state, you really have to look at total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income, because some states that are very high tax at the state level are very low tax at the property tax level, and state and local governments share a lot of responsibility for state and local services. So this is all in, and this is data from the Federation of Tax Administrators, and it's just before the temporary tax increase. And this compares Illinois to its Midwestern neighbors. Total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income, we ranked 42nd in the nation, 8th lowest, 2nd lowest in the Midwest to Missouri. 5th largest population and economy. And if you're curious, yes, this includes every property tax, every sales tax, every excise tax, every alcohol tax, every driver's license fee, every hunting fee, every state and local tax or fee compared to that in every other state. All publicly available data. Very low tax before the temporary tax increase. Now, we did have a temporary tax increase. It raised billions of dollars, $7 billion in revenue, so we bumped up. We went from the second lowest taxing state in the Midwest to the second lowest taxing state in the Midwest. We stayed the second lowest taxing state in the Midwest. We did not become Taxachusetts with that. Hey, meanwhile, and I don't know if I gave you this slide. No, I didn't, so I'm just going to talk about it. In 2010, it's a very interesting year, that year when we were super low in tax burden. That was the first year of full economic recovery post-Great Recession, right? The Great Recession ended in June of 2009. So 2010 is the year that you had a full recovery, no direct taint of Great Recession. Take a wild guess. What two states in the Midwest do you think did the worst jobs growing their economies during that full year of recovery? Illinois and Missouri. They were the bottom two. The two lowest taxing states. Now, why? In all likelihood, because they had to cut spending on services far more than their neighboring states that had more tax revenue. And by cutting spending on services, they were cutting the wages of middle-income workers who then spent less in their consumer economies, which had a multiplier effect that was negative. That's all. Pretty common sense stuff. But I'm giving you this data because I want to say one thing right now that is contrary to everything you read, but is supported by every piece of peer-reviewed data. There is no statistically meaningful correlation between a state's tax policy on the one hand and its economic growth on the other. None. There's not even a statistically meaningful correlation between national economic growth and national tax policy. Other things matter more. So when it comes to tax policy, what's crucial is you get it right so you could fund an adequate level of core services, right? The economy, other things matter much more. Here's the depiction of structural deficit for Illinois. Now, every other data point I've given you so far has been something we at CTBA call math. It is not modeling. It's publicly available data set that we just added, subtracted, multiplied, divide. You could do it, check our numbers, peer reviewed. This is modeling because it's a projection going forward. We wanted to see if our current level of revenues would support our current level of services. We had this peer reviewed by 4 different independent economists at universities, including one from Knox College, by the way, a guy named Jim Nolan. Do you know Jim? Great guy. And the head of state and local tax at the GAO in Washington, D.C. Passed with flying colors. Now, why? We use the same assumptions the Congressional Budget Office does when it makes projections. And here are those assumptions. Assume no change in law. Adjust going forward solely for historic rates of inflation and population change, and assume a normal economy. The one other assumption here is that we actually started with a balanced budget in 2015. We didn't. We had that $5.94 billion deficit, but I'm a Pollyanna. Let's assume we did. If our revenues and expenditures were equal, over time, would our revenues be able to continue to support our level of services plus pay the debt our state has incurred? The green bar is the growth in the cost of services, adjusted for inflation and population change, plus our debt service obligations. That's not adjusted for anything. We know what those payments are. The red bar is our current law and tax policy. You see the problem? And we're low spending. And we've been cutting spending. So, if we want to solve the problem in a good government way that doesn't imperil core services, not just that vulnerable populations rely on, but that, I don't know, school kids rely on, we need to raise taxes. Here's how, real quick. Well, first, pension ramp. See that red bar? That's the current law on paying the pension bill. You think we're going to make those payments? Yeah, me neither. We re-amortized it, refinanced it, look at it out We get the system 75 to 80% funded. We pay all benefits to all workers, current and future, who retire. And we save the state billions, and we get them healthy. You got to change the funding plan. That's number one. Number two, expand the sales tax base to consumer services. 45 states have a sales tax. We have the most narrow base. Why? We don't tax services. Everybody else in the nation taxes services more. The red bar shows you the percentage of the Illinois economy over time made up of the sale of goods, what we do tax. See how that's declining? That's what we tax. And that's now only 17% of our economy. The blue bar, that's what we don't tax. 72% of our economy. But, got to bring it in. Can't leave it out. Income tax. We got to bump it up by more than a point. A point raises $3.3 billion in revenue. We probably need to raise closer to $4.5 billion from the income tax right now. That, an expansion of the sales tax base to service. I'm not going to get into the details of it, taxing some retirement income but keeping the exclusion for everyone with $50,000 a year or less in AGI, solves all our fiscal problems. Re-amortize that pension debt. Within 2 years, we have a balanced budget. Within 3 years, we could start doing a better job of funding education, health, and social services. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our speakers. And now we have at least a half an hour for questions from everyone. Are there some more questions coming up here? Do we need that, though?
Well, if you want to pass them to the panelists.
Okay. All right, fine. Yeah, okay, good. All right, we're going to use this for the answers. Here's a question for Scott Drury. Why would both Democrats and Republicans assume that Illinois citizens object to income tax increases of 4.5, 8, or 10%? Maybe we are willing to pay.
I don't think that it's Democrats and Republicans that think that. It's, you know, it's what we hear when we read the papers, the same papers you read. It's what we hear when we talk to constituents. No one, I shouldn't say no one, very few people call my office and say, hey, I think we should have the tax rate at 10%, Representative. But if I said, hey, I think I'm going to have a proposal to lower it to 1, people can get behind that. And they get behind it because they don't really look at all the bar graphs and the line and the pie charts and the lines going up and down. And they also don't think about that because what Ralph was saying and what I was saying is that Illinois for so long has funded its economy on fumes that people have gotten used to it. So why would anyone in their right mind want to pay 6% when they can get the same level of services at what they believe is 4%? And that's exactly what he was talking about for, you know, the beginning of his presentation, which is Illinois' economy has been built on smoke and mirrors. We cobble stuff together and we put a tax rate on it and then we make it work. And for anybody who likes Governor Rauner or anybody who hates Governor Rauner, the one thing that he is doing, like him or hate him, is he is showing Illinois, for the most part, what 3.75% buys you. And if you like it, then get behind it. If you don't like it, then you need to make some noise and tell people that you don't like it. But this is what it is. It's not smoke and mirrors as much anymore, and I think that needs to be said because the last few governors didn't do that. We borrowed $10 billion to pay our pensions. One thing that Ralph didn't say is not all $10 billion even went to pay the pensions. They borrowed the money and then they used that for other stuff too. All right? And so we have to stop doing that. And so my theory in what I'm talking about really is, before you can move to what Ralph has been talking about, is the public needs to believe that it needs to happen. And I don't think the public at large believes it yet. And until they believe it, it is hard to accomplish all the things you need, because they still think, well, 3%, everything looks the same as 5%, so why wouldn't I pay 3? And I think that's the problem. And I don't think it's a Democrat or Republican problem, it's a credibility problem. We have lied to the public for so long, and I shouldn't say we because I haven't been part of it, but government has lied to the public for so long that the public has gotten used to it, and it's very hard then to bring it back to reality.
The next question states Illinois has very high property taxes and income taxes combined. Now, Mr. Martiri may have dispelled that notion, but where is the money going to come from in terms of raising revenue? And this questioner notes that people are moving out of the state of Illinois now.
So I'm going to answer that one because it'll be fun for me. So, number one, overall, I hope you now know that we are very low tax, including the property tax. If you isolated out the property tax, it is one of the top 5 or 6 highest in the nation, the reliance on property tax in isolation, which gives you then some perspective on how low tax we are at the state level. If, when you add that in, we drop down to the bottom 10% in total state and local tax burden, right? So we are way undertaxed. I mean, that's the data number one. So we absolutely need a tax increase. The way to get it is expanding the sales tax base, increasing the income tax rate, and taxing some retirement income. Number two, people are leaving the state of Illinois. Yes, they are. In fact, they have every single year except one for the last 90 years. We've been net out migration every single year. There was no increase in net out migration after the temporary tax increase. That is a myth. Yes, more people from the state of Illinois move into the state of Indiana and or the state of Wisconsin than vice versa. However, a greater percentage of the population of Indiana and a greater percentage of the population of Wisconsin move into Illinois than vice versa. See, they're smaller population states, but a greater portion of their population comes here than a portion of our population goes there. And you know where they're moving? They're coming into Chicago and the collar counties, which, if you look at our sales taxes and our property taxes, are the highest tax areas of the state. So all this malarkey about migration is really off point, and it's done intentionally to mislead rather than inform the general public on the impact of things like tax policy and migration. So every peer-reviewed study that has looked at those factors that contribute to migration have noted tax policy at best counts very little and on the margin if it counts at all. Why people move? Number one, they get a job somewhere else. Number two, they have family members somewhere else. Number three, the weather is nicer somewhere else. Hello? And number four, housing prices. Florida has no state income tax. People moved by droves into Florida for a long period of time from all northern states because it also had very low housing prices. Florida still has no state income tax, but their housing prices went up, and Florida started losing population. Tax policy doesn't drive these decisions. One last thing. If you tax millionaires, they're all going to run away from the state of Illinois, the job creators. No, in fact, they won't. Of the 5 states with the greatest number of millionaires per capita, 4 of them are some of the highest taxing states in the nation, and each of those 4 have special higher taxes for people with millionaire incomes and above. Let's get through the mythology and focus on reality.
There's a follow-up question to this. Would you fund education through reliance on the income tax versus the heavy reliance on the property tax in our state?
All right, so Tax policy is just like designing your investment portfolio. You don't have all large cap, you don't have all small cap, you don't have all bonds, you don't have all domestic, you don't have all of it in Asia. Different taxes play different roles. So would I shift more of the burden for funding education in Illinois to a combination of income and sales taxes and some of the burden away from property taxes? Yes, I would. Property taxes, however, should still cover anywhere from 38 to 44% of the cost of public education. If you get below those levels, what you're doing is losing a very stable revenue source that's needed in the overall fiscal mix to fund schools sustainably over time. Michigan tried that, and it was a real problem. It fell apart. They went to an incredibly responsive and non-stable revenue source to fund schools. But that said, right now in Illinois, the percentages are staggering. Local property taxes cover 63% of the cost of public education in our state. State-based revenues only cover 26%. We rank first in the nation in property tax reliance and last in the nation in the portion of school funding covered by the state. So we have one of the singly most inequitable education funding systems in the country, every year getting an F. And if you want to compare us to national averages, while we only cover 26% of the cost of K-12 education at the state level, the national averages for states to cover about 46%. And our property taxes cover 63% of the cost, the national average about 43%. So you can see we are a significant outlier. We belong at the extremes, and we need to come down from those extremes and move towards the middle.
So would you keep those property taxes local or send them to Springfield?
Well, keep them local. It should be a local revenue source. And any attempt to take property taxes and move them to Springfield not only would be politically dead on arrival, I'm guessing, with my two experts here on how things work in the General Assembly, every time they've tried that kind of robber baron approach in other states, it has failed miserably, even after passage. Within 3 years, they take it back. It's a really bad idea. We ought not do it.
Let me just follow up to say, I know a lot of you are aware that there is serious discussion this spring about reformulating how we do school funding. And one of the myths is that our property taxes are going to be shifted downstate to poor schools. That's not ever going to be considered. There is, and I cannot this evening describe to you the matrix of the way that there would be a retooling of the funding. Some of my colleagues are looking at a way to reposition state funds to schools that are more needy. So in other words, all the schools in the district I represent and that Representative Drury represents, under the plan that's being looked at now, would probably not get as much school funding. I don't know that it's going to come up for a vote. It's still being explored and kicked around and tossed and turned, but it's not going to be your property taxes that move.
In fact, so if I could dig into that. So the initiative is being carried by a downstate senator who's really trying to do a good thing. So first of all, let's give this gentleman credit for focusing on one of the most inequitable education funding systems in the nation and trying to fix that. I mean, anyone that spends political capital on fighting that fight should be applauded, not derided. That's number one. But number two, because we are so starved on revenue, the actual financial mechanisms in his approach are problematic if you don't put at least $450 to $500 million more in school funding in. If that much amount, and there's no current revenue source for that, if that amount doesn't go in, then the retooling of school funding under that approach would in fact take funding away, and not just from this community, from middle income communities, and particularly from special needs funding. So special needs funding would go down significantly in Illinois, and I don't think it's a good path to cut special needs funding to gain more equitable funding for lower income populations. The lower income populations need a significantly greater investment made in their education. It shouldn't come at the cost of other at-risk children. So the best solution would be use a lot of what's in that bill except the main funding mechanism and go to a full evidence-based model and then raise the tax revenue needed to fund it. And anyone wants a briefing on the evidence-based model, I'm actually in the process of drafting that legislation right now. I left that to come here. It'll be done really soon, and we have legislative sponsors, and I'd be happy to talk with you about it.
How do we encourage the growth of business and jobs in Illinois, and what impact would that have on our revenue and economic growth? Julie, do you want to answer that?
Sure, I can start with that. One of the things the governor said to me very specifically was that workers' compensation, while we did some reforms a few years ago, still needs to be looked at. And when I have visited with businesses in the community, I've heard that from them, that the rates tend to be high. I think that's one area that we can look at very specifically to see what we can do to encourage businesses to come rather than to avoid us.
Go ahead.
I think another thing that needs to be looked at is the fact that we're having this forum, right? We were calling it understanding the budget impasse, but it could be called understanding Illinois' dysfunction. So if you're a business that's not in Illinois, forget the tax rates, right? I mean, forget tax policy. You're just a rational person who's looking all over the country and you want to open a business and you're interviewing different states. And you land in this forum today. And you hear the discussion, whether it's the senator, whether it's me, whether it's Ralph talking about the fact that we cannot get our act together. We have no idea what our tax policies should be. We're cutting higher ed funding, we're cutting social services. Eventually we're going to cut infrastructure which the businesses need in order to get their products out of the state. Is this the type of place, if everything is equal, and forget taxes, is this where you're going to land your business? The fact is it's not. And so until Illinois can show a face of function, until it can show that it has a plan, whatever the plan is, and I talk with business leaders, Julie talks with business leaders, they want stability. They want stability. They don't want dysfunction. And if they knew what it was going in, then they could make an informed decision. But when they don't know anything, when they don't have any of the facts, how do they go back to their shareholders? How do they go back to their board and they say, Illinois is the place we want to be. We don't know what workers' comp rates are going to be. We don't know what's going to happen with tort reform. We don't know what's going to happen with tax policy. We don't know if there's going to be a budget. We don't know if you move your kids here, if schools will be funded. We don't know if the universities will be open next year. We don't know if there'll be new bridges. We don't know anything, but we think we should start a new company here. That is the problem. And until we can get our hands around that and have a plan, forget implementing it, just have a plan. It is very hard to lure people here. And I think Mayor Emanuel would tell you that. I think Governor Rauner would tell you that. I think John Cullerton and Mike Madigan would tell you that. And that is at the core of Illinois' problem, is our own dysfunction. It really is.
Does a graduated state income tax have a chance to be considered by our legislature? Wisconsin has one. Senator Morrison or Representative Drury, either one, or?
I've had some great discussions, especially with league members who are very interested, very passionate about putting this on the ballot. I think it absolutely should be put on the ballot. I think there should be a healthy discussion about it. And the people of Illinois, based upon all the information they get, have the right and should make a decision on that. I'd absolutely like to see it on the ballot.
The question is, will it, is it going to get a hearing? Here's the reality in the House, which tends to be more fiscally conservative than the Senate for whatever reason. I don't know why that is. We have 71 Democrats. All of the Republicans say they're not going to vote for it. One of the Democrats seemingly has become a Republican, not me, and has been voted out of office. But that brings it down to 70. Another one of my colleagues has publicly stated that he will never vote for the progressive income tax. So that brings it down to 69. and you need 71. So does it get called for a vote? Maybe, because you put some legislators on the spot and make them vote and see where they stand on it. But is it going to be on the ballot when you go to vote in November? As of today, and things change minute by minute in Springfield, it does not look like it's going to make it out of the House. But that can change, and I'm very involved in the discussions as well. But right now, just based on math, it doesn't look like the numbers add up.
Yeah, I actually have a more bleak look. So my organization drafted the amendment that Senator Harmon put in for the fair tax a couple of years ago. And it's the core amendment. It's the good government way to do it. We did an analysis of all the states that have a graduated rate structure and took the best out of all and put it together. And it doesn't specify any rate or whatever. But when Senator Harmon was pushing that, we had a supermajority of Democrats in the Senate and in the House, and we had a Democrat in the governor's office. And not only didn't we have 68 House Democrats on the bill, we didn't have 45. You got to have 71. And that's with all Democrats controlling the whole shebang. Now, maybe Governor Rauner has encouraged some Democrats to support this as a counter to him, and maybe that number went up some. Did it go all the way up to 68 or 69? I'm thinking not. So while and my organization is actually committed, this is core to our mission, is to have a graduated rate structure because it's sound fiscal policy. It's a very heavy political lift, and I think right now the state needs money last year. So focusing, organizing efforts on increasing the current income tax rate, expanding the current sales tax base, which could happen legislatively without a supermajority and with some Republican support, I think is a more productive thing to do in the short term to keep the wheels from falling off state government. And then the long-term fight always has to, I think, stay on point on getting a graduated rate structure permitted under our Constitution.
This is another question for Ralph. Is the current state of the pension debt such that there would be financial institutions willing to reamortize?
Okay, so this is the beauty of the reamortization. They just got to pass a law. We don't have to negotiate with anybody. It's money we owe our own pension systems. So that pension ramp, do you have the clicker?
Mm-hmm.
So if I could go back to that. That crazy red line at the top, that's a creature of statute. The only thing it takes to reamortize it is a new statute that replaces it, flattens it out like we did. So that's the kind of thing that just requires legislative action. You don't have to negotiate, you don't have to do anything, you just have to pass a new bill.
And here's another question. With a supermajority of the Democrats in Springfield, why not pass a budget and override the governor's veto?
The supermajority is probably one of the hardest things to deal with because, at least in the House, there are 71 Democrats. Mathematically, there's a supermajority. But being a Democrat, it's a really big umbrella that we bring into the mix. And just because there's 71 of us doesn't mean that 71 of us agree on every single thing that comes across the board. In my introduction, it said I'm largely known as one of the most independent people there. And so there are a lot of issues where I agree on votes with my Democratic colleagues, and there are issues where I don't. And there's a lot of us like that. So saying that we have a supermajority has actually been a blessing and a curse for the members in the House, because everyone thinks, oh, you could just do whatever you want whenever you want to do it, and that is a myth. And I think that's a good thing. I think that is a really good thing, because if we all just voted in lockstep all of the time, then it would cut against one of my main premises of being here, which is that the system could be trusted. If every time there's a vote and it seemed Democratic, we all lined up and voted for it, there's a problem with the system. So the supermajority is just not there in the House. The numbers are there, but on any given day, you got to go to each individual legislator and ask him or her, do you agree with this idea? And we can't just override everything. And there's also shown that the governor vetoed a lot of stuff last year, and I don't think we were able to override a single veto in the House. And that should kind of give you a sense of what this so-called supermajority actually is. I'm not in the Senate, so I can't talk about the dynamics over there. I don't know if there's anything to add.
Senator Morrison.
The General Assembly does not have the ability to override the governor's veto. Period.
Please comment on the University of Illinois receiving $180 million from the state and $21 million going to the new football coach.
Next question, Melanie. I don't have an answer to that.
Is Illinois pardon me?
It wasn't a General Assembly decision.
It was not a General Assembly decision, is what Mr. Martiri said. I don't think that any of these, anyone on this panel would have much influence on what the University of Illinois decides to pay its football coach. Is Illinois contemplating a millionaire's tax?
Illinois, for the last 2 or 3 years, has contemplated it. It's been called for a vote twice in the House. It needs a supermajority, and the supermajority is not there. I'll tell you, I have voted against it. And again, there's some people that thank me for it, and there's some people that beat me up for it. My rationale is this, and then I said it 2 years ago when I first said I wasn't in favor of it. Illinois needs stability. It needs overall stability, and when you look at what's going on in terms of tax policy and tax proposals, all that we see out there right now is chaos. And what do I mean by that? Well, right now, and this was the same thing, it's like Groundhog Day, the same thing existed 2 years ago. Everyone puts all these new proposals. We're going to have a progressive tax, or it's a fair tax, or this and that. We're going to have, and it's going to have rates. 2 years ago, we didn't know the rates, then we got some rates. And was it revenue negative, neutral, or positive? It was unclear. So this year, they bring up the progressive tax again, and there's different rates. The low rate, I think, is 3.5%. The high rate, I believe, is 9.75% for income over $1 million. So the progressive tax, separate from this millionaire's tax, which would be a tax of 3% on income over $1 million. The high rate on the progressive tax, if it were to pass and then be implemented, would be 9.75. On top of that, maybe, there would be another 3% that would be built into the Constitution. So now it's not 9.75, it's 12.75. And I just think these can't be voted on one by one by one. Like, what is the policy? What are we going to accomplish? And if we passed the millionaire tax 2 weeks ago or last week, would that hurt the progressive tax? Because now it's 12.75%. It's like we're working against each other, and makes me believe that all of these proposals, there's someone who just doesn't want any of them to pass. And so we just put them all out there, we vote on them. When it comes time for elections, people will have mailers, and they'll talk about how Julie and I vote on all of these different things, and how our opponents, in other areas vote on things. But it seems to be set up so that nothing will ever happen. I mean, that's my real take on it, because there's never been, since I've been there, and it's only been 3.5 years, a comprehensive proposal of what we want to do. And I think what Ralph was talking about, it's going to take a bunch of different things. There are a lot of ideas in the pot, and no one thing is going to solve Illinois' historic problem. And anyone who thinks that there is a quick fix is just wrong. It's taken decades, and it's taken Republican and Democratic governors to get here. And it's not going to be fixed in 1 year, and it's not because of just one budget that we can't pass. Illinois has a structural management problem, and it needs to be fixed, and all of these various tax policies in one-off proposals, it's just not going to do it.
Yeah, and so from the Goo group at the table, I testified against the millionaire's tax, even though my organization is committed to progressive taxation. So why did I do that? The Constitution should define broad rights, period. You don't put things like rates or income levels in the Constitution. It's inappropriate. You're stuck with that then forever. So what if in 20 years after inflation, $1 million level of income isn't the right starting point for the extra tax? You're stuck with it. It's in the Constitution. So we testified against the Speaker's proposal. That was the Speaker's proposal, and said, while we're all for amending the Constitution to permit a graduated rate structure, keep the rates out of the Constitution, keep the income levels out of the Constitution. Do that by separate legislation. So that's point one. Point two, he targeted the money to be raised from that, it was $1 billion, to public education on a per capita per student basis. So basically the same dollar amount for every kid, whether they lived in River Forest or Lake Forest or Barrington or Austin and Maywood and Bellwood. My kids in River Forest don't need that money. The kids in Austin and Maywood and Bellwood do. And so even the mechanism for utilizing the revenue once it was raised for millionaires was wrong. Likewise, on this new fair tax, if I'm asked to testify, and I probably won't be, I would testify against the bill. I can't imagine burning all that political capital to pass a new tax rate structure that generates, what, $1.5 billion? $1.9 billion. That at a minimum, you need to get 3.3 to 4.5 billion out of the income tax, or Illinois won't be able to keep government functioning at a minimum. And it's not like they change rates willy-nilly in this state. It takes 20, 30 years to get a rate change. You pass a bill that generates inadequate revenue, then I hope you like the level of services you're getting today that you won't be getting tomorrow, because they're not going to be able to fund them. So I'd have to testify against that rate structure, because it's just a horrible rate structure. It doesn't work. You got to be doing math as part of this function.
And this may be a good concluding question. Legislation is about compromise in a democracy. Why can't the Democrats compromise on the turnaround agenda of the governor if he would compromise on the tax increase?
So I think if you guys remember a couple hours ago when we started, I told you that's one of the first things I did with this governor. I told him what I would compromise on. I think he is completely sincere that he actually believes that his turnaround agenda is the best thing for Illinois. I don't think he's trying to destroy Illinois. I don't think he's being hostile, as I've heard some people say. He honestly believes it. He's sincere. I disagree with him on some of those elements, but I think there is definitely room for us as Democrats and for him as a Republican governor to work with us. I think we're getting a lot closer to that. One thing I want to tell you that you don't read in the Tribune every day that's not covered, because this isn't a political thing, there's a working group of rank and file legislators who meet quietly with appropriations staff, with leaders, in rooms where the press doesn't come and where the media is not invited. They're the people who actually are putting together that higher education bill. They're the ones that did that. They're the ones that are working on additional funding. They're the ones who are working on a budget for 16 and 17 together. There are people who really want this resolved. They're Republicans and Democrats. They're in both houses, and I hope you guys will join me in keeping your fingers crossed, because Illinois needs it, but there are people working both parties.
The issue with compromise is where is the middle, right? Any compromise, everyone's going to stake out a position, whether you're buying a house, whether you're in litigation, whether you're negotiating with your kids over dinner. There's going to, what is the compromise and where is it going to be? So the governor has said he's willing to consider revenue, but he won't say what revenue, how much revenue, until he hears what the Democrats are willing to give. So from a negotiating standpoint, that's difficult, because you don't know what you're negotiating against. He wants something concrete in return for nothing. I can tell you that in conversations I have had directly with the governor, I told him that his turnaround agenda, I think, is down to 4 items: workers' comp, tort reform, independent maps, and term limits. And I told him, before you suggested independent maps, I did. And my bill is sitting there. It was filed at the end of January before you filed yours. Same wording. I think he actually just took mine and refiled it. So he knows that I'm for it. Sounds like Julie's for it. So you have two Democrats sitting in this room right now that are willing to give him a quarter of what he wants. Term limits. I've proposed since my first day in office, three and a half years ago, that we should have term limits on the Speaker of the House and term limits on the Senate President, on their terms. If people want term limits on me and on Julie and on the rest of us, fine. I really don't think it's going to fix all the problems in Illinois, but if the public believes that that's what we need for better government, I'm all for it. All right, so that's half of the turnaround agenda. And I told him, I will stand up with you at a press conference and I will say that I am for those things. I am for half of your turnaround agenda. I'm willing to hear you out on the other items. And I bet you what, I can get some other Democrats to stand at the press conference with us. I've never heard a word back. Never. So if it's all or nothing, then what is the compromise? Is it going to be $5 billion in revenue? I mean, I don't know. But it makes the negotiation hard. And when you put politics into that, are there going to be supermajorities next year? Are you going to chip away at that? Do Madigan and Cullerton and Rauner really hate each other? And you add that into the mix of we don't even know what the negotiation is, it becomes pretty difficult. Like I said, the answer is right there. It was in the PowerPoint that I gave. The facts are the same. The solutions are the same. But there is a reason not to have a budget. Politically, it does both parties, at least both parties think this is true, it does us both a lot of good to be at war because it helps win elections. And we keep hearing this next election is a proxy on this and that and proxy on this and that. Well, in November, we'll see how that proxy war ends up. And then maybe we get something done. But until then, it's just this standoff, and I'm not proud of it. I don't like it. I try to be as honest as I can about it. But that is the reality as I see it. And if anyone has any other ideas, I'm always open to hear them. But from boots on the ground, being there for the last 11 months, there's just a lot of things complicating it, and it's not an unwillingness or a willingness to compromise, because like I said, at least 50% of it I'm willing to say, let's go, let's do it, and we get nothing.
As an outsider, I want to confirm what the senator and representative just said in one key way. If you were to take the governor and the speaker out of the equation and allow rank and file legislators in both parties to work on a budget, it wouldn't take you the 21 days. And what I'm impressed about having observed this is the amount of effort elected officials on both sides are willing to put into trying to find that compromise and working across party lines. This does not make the media, but it should, because I think people would have a lot more faith in state government if they understood how hardworking and how committed the vast majority of our senators and representatives were in Springfield. They really are working hard. And I do think in this particular stalemate, it's primarily driven by leadership.
I want to thank the League of Women Voters for putting together this incredibly informative program for us this evening. Thank you for all of you for taking time out of your busy lives to attend this program and become more informed about our government. And a special thanks to all three of our panelists this evening for a very stimulating and informative program. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay,